Welcome to Circle Around. On this podcast, we hope to see, analyze, reflect, and respond better to our context by asking meaningful questions that lead to better questions. Our conversation is aimed at helping believers make sense of their world and then reimagine a new way of responding faithfully with full presence to the challenges of our urban society. We are your hosts, Lusanda and Mahlatse Mashua.
We are in Erandini, Circle Around, where we get to have these cool conversations. Well, I get to have these cool conversations with you, and we invite others into how we talk about some of these issues. Now, we'd like to start by reflecting on the incarnation and reflecting on that scripture. And the Word became flesh and made his dwelling amongst us. Speaking about this idea of a God who looks at the mess that we've created as human beings and the mess that we've made of the world. And instead of staying outside, he comes into the world, he comes into the mess, he becomes intimately involved at the rescue mission. The greatest rescue mission in the whole world actually is about God coming to be with us in the mess of the world. And in that he participates in our pain. He understands very intimately what it means to live in a broken world where things are no longer working as he intended them to work. But at the same time, his very presence is a counter to that mess, because he introduces hope and a new way of thinking and seeing and experiencing the world. And so we live in this place where we are in between the pain, in between the hope, experiencing them both in this world that we live in because of God's intervention, because of this great incarnation event. But it's not just also this idea that it's a spiritual truth, but it's literally that God came, to be in the world, that he came in the flesh he was born at a particular time, in a particular place in history.
Yes.
In this world, right? First century Jerusalem. He comes in, and you can sort of imagine him living in a real town with real people, walking, and his feet gathering real dust. And my favorite story as I read the Gospels is a story where he's 12 years old, and his parents and his family, they all go up to Jerusalem and for the Passover, and they're returning from Jerusalem, they're coming back home, and a day later they realize that he's nowhere to be found in their midst. And so they panic and they go back to Jerusalem to look for him. After 3 days, they find him. Now, for them, he's been lost, but the contrast is that in his mind, he's not lost. In his mind, he's home. Because the conversation they have is, where have you been? And, you thank God that we found you, and now let's go home. And he doesn't seem to get what the fuss is about, because he goes, I had to be in my Father's house. And so there's a you think there's home. Home is, one way. I think I found home where it is. And so there's a sense of almost like this dual consciousness of where do you belong that he experiences as a 12-year-old. Yeah. But now coming back to this concept of experiencing both the pain as well as also the hope in this world because of this great incarnation event. Where this past week, Lusanda, have you experienced the pain of living in a broken world, and where have you seen the hope or where God's kingdom is breaking through?
That's excellent. Thank you so much, Lati. So for me, the place where I experienced the brokenness of this world was when I listened to the radio when they were talking about the findings from the Zondo Commission. That was particularly heartbreaking because in South Africa, where so many people are already experiencing a huge sense of displacement, where they're not affording housing or being evicted from their current housing, and there's such a housing deficit. There's a sense of lack of accountability and this accumulative lack of care and mishandling of government funds. And why that breaks my heart so much is because there was actually provision, but it was mismanaged, and that it's real people that really bear that cost, especially if you're thinking about COVID. At such a time, it's difficult to think that there are people that can handle those resources and really serve people in their place of need. And so that really, really broke my heart in terms of seeing how people can be displaced as a direct consequence of those in power that don't do what they're supposed to do with resources. And where I experienced a restoration of God's goodness was when I had the opportunity of going away with some really good friends of ours. Now I realize that rest is a luxury that many people don't have, because sometimes when one gets to rest, it also means they have to forego their income. And so for many of us, I realize that rest is actually a privilege. And so when I do get to experience rest, I'm really, really grateful, because there's something about rest that also insinuates that I can just exhale. I can recuperate in a place where I feel I belong and I won't be judged. And isn't that the interesting thing about belonging and rest, is that you get that sense of reprieve because you feel you're safe. And so just taking that time to rest was just really phenomenal for me, because it also spoke into the rejuvenation that I know I needed and that so many of us need. And so somebody said that sometimes to rest is actually in and of itself an act of resistance, because you are choosing to pause so that you can be replenished, so that you can continue to do the valuable work towards God's purposes in our lives. And thinking of rest and belonging, and how where we're able to rest also speaks of the place where we really, really belong. I remember a story that you once told about Papa and how his family moved to Graskop. Can you just tell me that story again?
Yeah, I think for many of us, we take it for granted that the concept of home means the same for everyone. So rest, like you're saying, belonging, identity, that's where your people are, and all of those things. But and that's also linked to place itself. But thinking about stories of displacement is to think about what happens when those concepts that have been tethered to a place get untethered violently when that place is taken away violently from them, which is a history, of our country. So Papa tells the story of how his family, when my family lived in Graskop, and in that area was mixed in a sense that you had black people and colored people living together, and actually that was also my family. My family is mixed in that sense. But then the government decided to zone that area out for only colored people, and that they would move black people to another area in Bushbuckridge, which is close, and which was a very hard thing, because in some sense you were tearing families apart, and like my family was. So the colored part of my family was to stay, the black part of my family had to move then to Bushbuckridge. And they describe in detail just the moment that those trucks would come, those government trucks would come, with those letters, GG. I don't know what they stand for, but every time my father tells that story, you can still see the GG, on those trucks. But the truck stops at your house, outside your house, and you had to drop everything that you were doing and pack all your belongings and get on, and never to come back to the place that you called home, and you were taken to a new place. And so if you were cooking, you'd switch off the stoves and take your hot pots and your half-cooked meal, get on a truck, and then move. And so when this happened to my family, my father was actually away at school. And so he received a letter telling him that he shouldn't come back to Graskop. That's no longer where home is, that he should come to Bushbuckridge. And so what had happened was, when they packed my family up and they moved them, they took them to Bushbuckridge. And the idea is that they would ask you where you'd like to be dropped off in Bushbuckridge. And if you didn't know, then you were at the mercy of the drivers to just pick a spot and say, get off, and then find materials to make shelter, because those weren't provided. You had to just find shelter and then pick a spot, and that was home. But my family was fortunate in the sense that we had a relative who worked for the magistrate in Bushbuckridge, particularly in health center, so they knew at least one reference point that they could say, please drop us off there. And that's how my family got to live there. And there was this landmark, which was a clinic that eventually gave the area where we lived its name, Health Center. Although we wouldn't call it Health Center because usually we're not answering the question, of where you're from. And that's specifically in English, Health Center. But in English, of course, because of the clinic, it's Health Center.
Yeah.
That's what it is. And so my father receiving this letter, telling him that he needs to go to a new place, talks about a time when he had to reconcile himself to the fact that he was no longer going back to the place that was very familiar to him, that he was going to a new place. Yeah. But, that's what he had to do. And so when school finished, he traced my family. And after looking for a long time, came across someone who knew my big Nyati family and pointed them in the right direction. But again, searching until he eventually found the place where the family had settled, so you could see this place in the distance. And so speaking about a sense of relief, this joy of finally arriving somewhere that you could call home. Of course, you need to redefine what that is in this context. But one complication, when my family moved, they picked up a small puppy. And this puppy had now grown into a big dog, and which didn't know my dad, of course. And so when my dad saw the family or, the gathering, he starts approaching and the dog sees him. And my dad sees the dog, and the dog then starts to chase him, and he finds himself having to run away from this dog. And so he runs, and after a while, the dog gives up the chase. He's safe from the dog, but he finds himself sitting on a rock and he's weeping. And he's asking these questions: where is home? Yeah. Where do I belong?
Yeah, that's so haunting. In a sense, it feels like that question, where is home? Where do I belong? That question being asked by whether it's a dejected picture of Papa in the past, or it's being asked by communities today, collectively asking, where do I belong? It's an important question. And I think it's also part of why the story about the Zondo Commission is so jarring for me, that there are still many in our communities, in our society, that are dejected in their awkward places and asking the question, where do I belong? And I think part of our faithfulness as people who follow Jesus is to keep seeing these stories that put people back in that place. And so as much as that happened to Papa in the past, there's something about this story that's linking it to the present. And I also, I'm quite interested also in the things that keep perpetuating, whether it's our inability to see how people can still feel excluded in our present world, as well as the language that we use to help people understand that they're not included and they're not welcome, but they're a visitor in this space. I'd be very interested to know where you've seen that.
Yeah, it's a South Africanism, isn't it, to ask people, where are you originally from?
Yeah.
Right? The first question is, where are you from? And then the second question, where are you originally from? Now, in one sense, it speaks about how dynamic the concept of, I guess, a home has been and is in our context. But it is also, I think, it also speaks about displacement as well. There's a history of displacement in our country, and broader than that we need to be aware of, because if we are not aware of the stories of displacement, then we are in danger of participating in them, and in so doing helping to revisit pain upon people that is contained in the story of their displacement.
Yeah.
So for instance, I used to, when I got into an Uber one of the favorite things I like to do, because it's usually somebody who's new that I'm meeting for the first time. I love meeting new people.
Yeah.
And as an introvert, I've got a bit of a script, right? I think for some people it occurs naturally that you just make conversation, but I have to have a little bit of a script and think through certain questions, that can help the conversation. But because I'm interested in meeting the person, how's your day been so far, and that sort of thing. But the one question that would come, and I used to pride myself actually, that I could be able to pick up where people's accents were coming from. So, I used to say to people, so I can pick up that your accent is from such and such a country.
Yes.
Where are you originally from? Right? Because they've just said, I live in Cape Town. Where are you from? Well, Cape Town, or chosen a place in Cape Town. But I can pick up from the accent that actually you're from such and such a country. Or if I couldn't, that's what I'd ask, where are you from? And they'd be very gracious, and we'd have this conversation, and we'd talk about the cities and different countries and that sort of thing. The one time that I didn't do that, as we were arriving at the place, at our destination, as I got out of the car, the driver then turned to me and said, hey, thanks for not asking where I'm from. It was the first time we were meeting.
Yeah.
And I was very surprised, but then he went on to explain, because he told me that actually his is a story of pain. He left his country fearing for his life, and there's no prospect of him ever going back.
Yeah.
So the question, where are you from, is a story that invites him to relive and perform his trauma for me, for the sake of making small talk in our conversation. And in a sense, I also have, then I realized that, what I was doing unwittingly is saying to people, listen, I noticed that your accent tells me that you don't belong here, or you haven't always belonged here. So tell me where it is that you belong. And I should have known, and I should have seen it, because it's just a story of our country where people ask you, hey, we notice you have an accent. Which school did you go to? Where's your home?
Yeah.
Where do you belong? We've noticed this and that about you. So I didn't realize, I didn't make that connection that's what I was doing. So seeing, I think, with a lens of displacement will help us not to participate in, I think, stories that dehumanize people, or stories that remind people of the pain that is part of their displacement story.
Absolutely. Going back to that initial story of Jesus being a 12-year-old boy who gets left behind, or let me say, who stays behind in Jerusalem against his, I would be livid if my child decided, this is the choice that I'm making now for my spiritual growth.
Why I keep
let me just stay behind in pilgrimage.
Yeah.
I'd be so upset. And
no, sorry, I was just going to say, that's why I keep thinking that, if Jesus had a black mom.
Yeah, no, it would be over. It would be over. He wouldn't have had a chance to talk about his spiritual dad. Yeah. So then I thought about the fact that, he could have gone back home and sulked and then decided to disengage, right? Because this world meant there's another place where he can't be, right? But then we have a Savior who came into our brokenness and experienced that longing to be in the temple and to be about his Father's business, but having to go back and to be raised in a human family, experience human things, experience human betrayal, experience human loss, experience human pain, experience human political realities, because he was living in a Roman environment that was being colonized by Rome. Well, it was Jewish, but it was being colonized by Rome, and there were things that were happening there that were violent for his community, but he engaged completely. And I'm so comforted by the idea that Jesus that walked in an actual place, that lived in an actual town, knows what each of us experience, right? In our different ways where we experience displacement. I'm also comforted by the fact that he doesn't create this escapism of a spirituality, but he helps people to be a neighbor which is why I just love that the greatest commandment has to do with loving God and loving your neighbor. And I think that's because he came here to be neighbor, right? And to be fully present in our pain, and to be fully present in showing a way back. Because that's what the incarnation does, doesn't it? It's telling us that God came to us so that we can receive the invitation of being with him too. And I'd love just to hear from you in terms of how that, this idea of being neighbor in a world where displacement happens, how does that story of Jesus just talk to you about how we can be better neighbors to one another?
So then when the young lawyer asks, Jesus, what can I do to inherit eternal life? Jesus gives him a standard that he thinks he's unable to live up to. Love God with everything. Love your neighbor as yourself.
Yeah.
Interesting to me, I guess as a side note, that he picks loving your neighbor as the one that he wants to challenge. He doesn't challenge the loving God with everything, but he thinks that's easy. But what is difficult is loving your neighbor. And so the challenge to Jesus is, but who is my neighbor? And then Jesus tells a story that that has been titled or called the story of the Good Samaritan. But at the end of the story, Jesus asked the question, who became a neighbor? Out of these, the failure of those who expected, right, to act right in a particular way, and highlighting the right behavior of the one who was not expected to act in rightly, or to be the savior, the hero of the story, then Jesus says, who became a neighbor? The original question was, who is my neighbor? In other words, who qualifies for me, for me to move, or for me to move in their direction, for me to help, for me to be part of their story, so that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But then in Jesus's question, the subject has changed. Who became a neighbor?
Who became a neighbor?
Who became a neighbor? In other words, how do I qualify myself in this case to be the neighbor, rather than trying to find neighbor? I'm the one who have to qualify myself or show myself as a neighbor. So the story, I guess it helps me in this conversation of place, where we have said that place is not incidental when you look at God's salvific plan and story.
Yeah.
It's not incidental to that, but you see that it's very important. Time and time again, God uses place to even communicate to people, to locate people. I have seen, I have heard, even people in exile, for instance. You see how he looks at the people who are displaced and how he engages. And of course, we know that even in the story of the Good Samaritan, he's the one, and in the incarnation, he's the one who is the hero from the outside, who comes in and breaks into the story, right? And so place is not incidental to God's plan. It invites me to be able to see place better. It invites me to understand the stories that you spoke about previously that are encoded in place. Stories of pain and stories of victory and joy, in order for me to be able to see people properly, to be able to engage people properly, and where appropriate, to see the things that dehumanize people, to be able to make them visible, and to be able to resist, to be able to dismantle them. And then the things that affirm the humanity that God has already inferred in human beings, those things to make visible, but to help sustain them, to participate in amplifying those things, so that people's lived reality and experiences can change, can improve wherever it is. That also means that, Lusanda, I have to look into space very differently, right? I have to think about who lives where and why.
Yeah.
And ask myself, what is my role in that story? Because if I'm going to be invited into the story of answering the question, am I going to be a neighbor? Then I've got to see the neighborhood.
Yeah.
Then I've got to see myself as well as how can I be humanized in the process of finding my neighbor? How can I be elevated in the process of acting like a neighbor, especially if I'm coming from a place where I've got resources or there's some privilege that I can leverage on behalf of those who don't have those.
That's stunning, and I think this is exactly where we kind of, circle around just to start jumping off from that point to go back and say, what, we started at the story of the incarnation and how Jesus came near to us, and you told the story of how when he was in the temple, he was living in that double consciousness. There's this double citizenship that he was experiencing, and how God entering into our story very well understands where we are in terms of sometimes feeling we're here, but also there. And there are a lot of, there's lots of those stories that you told about South Africanisms where we don't see that we are using small talk or curiosity to also over communicate how people don't belong. And again, just thinking about what you've just shared now, like how we don't make God a willing participant, or we don't allow ourselves to just go with the flow of continuing to not be reflective to ourselves about how, whether it's our access, our privileges, our resources, it's not making us ask the key question, how can I be neighbor better? Right? I feel that that's really an important place to land this conversation, because we walk away with that, where we're asking ourselves, how do we become neighbor better? Well, we've come around to this conversation beautifully. Thank you so much, Mahlatse. I just really appreciated some of the things that you shared.
Lovely talking to you as always.
It's always lovely talking to you too.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sitting and coming full circle with us. Our conversation and growth as people of faith is ongoing, and so we'd love to keep journeying with you. Our circle around family, seeing how we can keep our cycle of faith, action and reflection continuing. So follow our Instagram accounts and join us next week as we continue circling around.